Having fermented all the extreme figures of sexual mythology for a whole century, La Femme Fatale is fading away from the social and cultural scenes. Similarly, with the departure of John Galliano, the sensuous and irresistible seductress has been superseded by the fearless and indomitable feminist. In his influential and controversial book on Western literary canon, Harold Bloom caustically remarked that he shuddered to contemplate the feminist reading of Dante or Goethe, since these are the authors who idealized and therefore demonized the woman. The second act of Goethe's Faust closes with the words, "Woman, eternally, show us the way." A woman now is likely to ask, to what? Yet, this is precisely what is happening today at Dior. We are witnessing the feminist reading, or rather, the feminist rewriting of the quintessentially feminine brand. Ever since her arrival at the helm of Dior, Maria Grazia Chiuri has been promoting women artists, from modern feminists to the 18th century conteurs. Their fairy tales, seditiously ironic, of the Louis XIV court at Versailles, have been recast in the former siege of patriarchal power. The Galerie de Glace, whose mirrors used to reverberate triumphs of the Sun King, was recently refashioned to explore the dark, thorny aspects of the feminine.
My idea was to come here and symbolically replace these mirrors with my mirrors that I consider feminist mirrors because they put conflict where there used to be power.
On the contrary, Maria Grazia's tenure at Dior has not been riddled with conflict. She has rather brought a clear message and a sober commercial policy that the brand seems to welcome in the aftermath of Galliano's fever-pitch creative intensity. If Christian Dior strove for harmony and wholeness, and John Galliano generated explosive tension, then the word for Maria Grazia's feminine is stability. The woman is neither idealized nor is she demonized. The poles lose the intensity of either positive or negative charge, and each semicircle flattens out into a straight line. Curvatures that previously expressed either divine frenzy or carnal bliss, or else throes of passion, are smoothed out. The ideals that were previously coded into fabric folds and modal poses are currently expressed black on white in quote emblazoned looks, which open most collections. They allow no misinterpretation or ambiguity. These different feminine types correspond to distinct periods in Occidental culture that Dior's designers appear to epitomize. Christian Dior was an adept of traditional values and homo religioso, or religious man, whose consciousness was defined by the sacred and the transcendent. John Galliano embodied the quintessence of modernism, and Maria Grazia Chiuri has ushered the venerable French house into post-modernity. Christian Dior's work and writings are permeated with Christian and Neoplatonic mysticism, and we don't need to turn to the Middle Ages in search of his inspirations. He could have been influenced by the spiritualism of Henri Bergson, who, in his lectures at Collège de France, notoriously popular with women, spoke of élan vital and of the stream of life. Bergson's notion of parfum enivrant intoxicating fragrance of mystical love, echoes of Dior's parfum qui sent l'amour, perfume that exudes love. The goal of this metaphysical love is to achieve contact and partial coincidence with a creative effort which is of God if it is not God himself. Christian Dior made the unraveling of inner potentialities and their coincidence with the stream of life visually obvious. Christian Dior believed that Couturier possessed the power of transfiguration, while Bergson stated that the mystic wanted to complete the creation and make humanity what it would straightway become had it been able to assume its final shape without the assistance of man himself. The mystic saw his task in imparting the vital impetus to all humanity, and Cecil Bitton testified that Christian Dior possessed inexhaustible vitality and zest, infusing his work with radiating vigor. This artistic paradigm is described by Hegel in his Aesthetics. The artist lives in the original unity with the material of his art. It is part of his innermost self. He brings before our contemplation the soul of objects. Christian Dior spoke of dresses as living creatures whom he baptized. For this reason, he could not attend buying sessions. Poor dresses, what a fate is theirs. During the slaughter, I prefer not to enter the salon. On the contrary, the modernist artist was the demiurge who produced his own world, being beholden to no one. Daniel Bell states that modernism derived its power from the idolatry of the untrammeled self. This cultural trend opened up some new, reflexive, deep subjectivity. It brought about the carnival of the interiorized fetishism, as Lucas called it. The modernist artist aspired to unlimited self-realization through hyper-stimulated sensitivity. In Modernity, an incomplete project, Jürgen Habermas notes that for modernists, historic memory is replaced by the heroic affinity with the extremes of history. The decadent recognized themselves in the barbaric, the wild, and the primitive. Modernity lives on the rebellion against all that is normative. Its aesthetic consciousness is addicted to fascination without horror, which accompanies the act of profaning and yet is always in flight from the trivial results of profanation. Galliano shares with modernism its obsession with death, which in the 19th century pervaded works of artists across borders and temperaments. In his dialogue between fashion and death, Giacomo Leopardi renders fashion as a cruel and destructive character. Fashion ultimately proves to death their sisterhood in describing the infliction it causes to human body. Galliano's erudition spanned across styles and cultures, bringing to his sartorial eccentricity the elitist touch of high modernism. Therefore, his creations hold a prominent place in museums and exhibitions. The reason why such a modernist figure as Galliano was at all possible at this late stage of capitalism is the nature of the fashion industry, or rather of the big couture houses. They have preserved ateliers, arts and crafts as archaic holdovers within the modern economy. Modern art celebrated, dramatized, and drew its power from older forms of individual production. Another reason is the attachment of Dior and LVMH top management to the romantic modernist value of genius.
yeah.
The arrival of Maria Grazia Curie marks the transition from the modernist work or Gesamtkunstwerk to a postmodern text or assemblage. The difference between work and text can be illustrated by juxtaposing the movie for the 2021 Haute Couture collection with Galliano's 2006 Haute Couture show. Both address the issues of death and the unconscious. Galliano presents ferocious, ominous, lugubrious, and painful aspects of death. These images erupt from the unconscious, while Maria Grazia Curie shows death as a new beginning, stressing its benign and serene aspects. The whole collection, so sumptuously filmed, made me think of the reproach that Deleuze and Guattari made to psychoanalysis with its perception of the unconscious as a representational theatre, notably the ancient Greek theatre, with the Oedipus myth in its center. In this particular instance, we deal with a tarot game. While the end of the movie borrows alchemical symbolism, showing the conjunction of opposites and the emergence of the divine hermaphrodite that alchemists also called the stone. Regardless of the reference system, this approach considers the unconscious as only capable of reproducing prescribed roles and predefined patterns, whereas Deleuze and Guattari suggested viewing it as a productive factory that could generate new and spontaneous forms. And this was the daunting, spectacular, and somewhat tragic endeavor of modernism and of such designers as Galliano and McQueen. Today, at Dior, as in the case with the above-mentioned movie, artists are invited ad hoc to provide a creative framework to otherwise similarly structured and rationally merchandised collections. Consistent assortment of reconducted pieces has been instrumental to secure client loyalty, improve sellout, and streamline production costs. Addressing lamentations of many critics about certain lack of creativity in contemporary fashion, I would like to remind that fashion merely follows current cultural trends. In his book, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, Fredric Jameson explains that the status of art and culture has had to be irrevocably modified in order to secure the new mode of production. The artistic and cultural dimension of postmodernism is popular, if not populist. It dismantles many of the barriers to cultural consumption that seemed implicit in modernism.
What is pop? 是经典，是复古，也是彩色。
What is pop?
未来主义的东西。
What is pop? 音乐未来的冲撞。
古典音乐也是流行。
Dior 就是 pop。Disco。
Our social order is more democratic. It doesn't need prophets and seers of high modernist type, either among its cultural producers or politicians. Careers are made not by subjective talent, inner richness, or inspiration, but rather by strategies of almost military character, based on technical superiority, on assessment of the current situation, and on evaluation of its permutation system on the spot. But one should not try to outsmart the text. Playfulness of form, aleatoric production of new ones, or joyous cannibalization of the old. For example, the 2021 Spring-Summer Ready-to-Wear campaign reinterpreted Caravaggio painterly motifs and techniques. All these means and devices will not put you in such a relaxed and receptive a disposition that, by a happy accident, a great new form would come into being anyhow. And possibly this great new form is not even necessary. Speed of information, inadequacy of a single individual in the face of cumulative knowledge of humanity at large, radical separation of consumers and producers, absence of social sympathy between them, have led to lowered sensitivity to meaning, or to what Lipovetsky called apathy, new look. God is dead. The great ends are extinguished, but nobody seems to care. The depreciation of ideals and the resulting void of meaning have not led to some metaphysical grief. Lightness of being does not seem to be unbearable anymore. If the great negative emotions of the modernist movement were anxiety, terror, the being unto death, what characterizes the newer intensities, which have also been described in terms of schizophrenic submersion, is the messiness of a dispersed existence or the perpetual temporal distraction of post-60s life. Man is no longer in a strange seeker of the meaning of existence. Psychic fragmentation is now raised to a qualitatively new power. Structural destruction of the dissented subject has now become the very motor and existential logic of late capitalism itself.
Cover the city. Dancing, 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 dancing. We are going out tonight. Dancing, dancing, dancing. I surrender, opening my heart to all living creatures.
Philosophers eagerly proclaimed death of the subject and end of meta-narrative. With regards to love, it has been desacralized, then de-eroticized. Jameson observes that cultural products of the postmodern era are not utterly devoid of feelings, but rather such feelings, which Jean-François Lyotard called intensities, are now free-floating and impersonal. Sartorially, there is a noticeable switch from opulent, decorative, Baroque cineosity to classic restraint. The distinction between these two styles is important. First, because it was made by Christian Dior himself at his Conférence à la Sorbonne in 1957, where he spoke about dress architecture.
Ce n'est pas un vain mot de parler de l'architecture d'une robe. Une robe se construit, et elle se construit selon le sens des tissus. Le sens des tissus, c'est le secret de la couture. Et c'est un secret qui dépend de la première loi architecturale, celle de l'obéissance à la pesanteur. Le droit fil et le biais sont les deux sens principaux. Le droit fil est, si vous le voulez, le sens classique, et le biais peut être considéré comme une sorte de sens baroque.
What is more, these two styles represent different relationship of body to space and of an individual to the surrounding world.
Chacun de nous, individu, sujet, en contact par cette enveloppe de notre corps qui n'est pas nous et qui pourtant nous touche de si près avec le vaste monde extérieur.
Certainly, at the time of Dior, prêt-à-porter did not exist. Price policy, manufacturing process, and sales techniques are so different for couture and for prêt-à-porter that direct comparison between houses past and present is incorrect. However, formal analysis reveals certain pattern in the evolution of the feminine. Comparison of the three Dior landmark designers reveals that Christian Dior combined both styles. John Galliano favored the Baroque, and Maria Grazia Chiuri has a clear propensity for the classic style. John Galliano was faithful to the sartorial vocabulary of Dior, which aesthetically relied on Hogarth's analysis of beauty. In the 18th century, Hogarth defined the waving line, composed of contrasting curves, as the line of beauty, and the serpentine line, waving or twisting, as the line of grace. Both Dior and Galliano willingly use these lines in designs and model poses. Dior's collection names testify to his commitment to Hogarth's aesthetics. His collections were eloquently called, in 1948, Zigzag, in 1950, Oblique, and in 1952, Signeuse. John Galliano inherited the biased cut and the asymmetry. The predominance of the diagonal is obvious in such dress details as deep asymmetrical cleavages and asymmetrically draped collars, as well as scissor-cut skirts. The couturier recurred to and enhanced such sophisticated couture techniques as multi-layered skirt pleats, where meters of fabric were draped into meandering folds, lateral hip amplifying pleats, laminated flounces or volant feuilleté, lampshade draping, and rocaille treatment of surfaces. In his collections, John Galliano revived the technique of circular and spiral-shaped draperies. Using new fabrics with amazing virtuosity, he quoted swirling folds and protruding pleats on breast-enhancing bustiers. He was fond of the iconic exaggerated busks as well as voluminous, inwardly bulging flounces. These billowing and ballooning flounces are reminiscent of the plethora of clouds and angel feathers in paintings and sculptures of the Assumption. In Galliano's creations, even fabric texture reproduced the stucco clouds of the Baroque reliefs. During the Galliano period, swirling folds on bustiers and skirts became more vibrant, curvatures more vivid, colors more flamboyant. It is the period of maximum floridness and efflorescence of sartorial techniques. All these means are deployed to create the illusion of movement, where forms approach, entwine, and fuse, expressing the beauty of the impalpable. Constructional and actual is dissolved into harmonies and polyphonies. On the contrary, Maria Grazia Chiuri prefers static, regular folds, like in a Doric pillar.
It's beautiful, beautiful, really beautiful.
In the classic style, beauty resides in the perfection of eternally valid proportions, in Euclidean relation of beam and load, in the bodily principle of load and inertia, in the sensuous element of concrete lines and planes, in the filling of bounds. Heinrich Wölfflin, in his Principles of Art, explains that this style is crystallized in the forms that bear the stamp of absolute inevitability. It follows the revealed law in which every part looks unchangeable and immovable. The tectonic style operates in the sense of limitation and completeness. The rigor of tectonic form is underlined by drapery that falls straight down. The figure is firmly anchored and footing is emphasized. A part of the hem is removed to show that the foot is planted on the full sole, which is clearly demarcated from the floor. The classic style has conceived beauty as a kind of satiety, the relation between energy and repose, which feels to be an enduring state. In the classic style, unity is perceived as harmony of regularly distributed free parts, where each figure is separately apprehensible and self-sufficient. In Baroque plurality, forms are interrelated. They merge into a colorful, quivering appearance. Certainly, Maria Grazia-Curie quotes traditional, so to speak, Baroque elements of the house, such as plis, livre, lampshade drapery, bustier Cadillac, veste bar, asymmetrical cleavages, and spiral-shaped drapery. But their aspect is de-dramatized, rendered more wearable and casual. It is, in a sense, classicized. The classic and Baroque are two form languages. The first designates the beauty of what is, of the become, of the enduring form, measurable and finite. On the contrary, Baroque expresses liberation from all earth gravity and capture of space. The soul evolves in a dynamic universe and roves into all distances. Sense limits are transcended in favor of space, and sensation penetrates beyond the solid object onto the realm of the immaterial. It is the art of passionate tension. Baroque creates the impression of the becoming, of the unrest, of change and longing. In the classic style, what is important is the public aspect of the person, not the fullness of inward life. Oswald Spengler, in his Decline of the West, associated classic style with the Aristotelian notion of zoon politikon, translated as political animal. Indeed, the preponderance of the classic style has coincided with the politicization of the brand discourse. Fashion shows are often turned into a stage for feminist claims, and there is hardly a subject that has not been converted into political currency. The classic style directly correlates to the new feminine type currently promulgated by the House. Badiou, the famous French contemporary philosopher, has called this new type of woman not just the Dior woman, but a modern Occidental woman, the woman one. Badiou coined this term, referring to the French security system, which designates men as one and women as two, which led Simone de Beauvoir call her feminist masterpiece The Second Sex. But Badiou suggests taking these numbers not as indication of hierarchy, but of internal structure. Traditionally, the feminine is opposed to the strong affirmation of the one, to the single power that characterizes the masculine position. The woman connotes a process more than a position, the process of transition and transcendence. Female archetypal figures display this power of metamorphosis. Mary is the Virgin, but she is also the grieving mother of the crucified Son. Eve is the seductress, but she is also the mother of humanity. In traditional Dior, examples of feminine duality abounded. The household wife or mother turned into a dangerous seductress. The seductress often landed on the shores of true love, and the lover was only sublime because she was very close to a female mystic. Traditional oppression kept the feminine power of transition within a closed circle of predefined roles, but it allowed the transformation itself. It is noteworthy how many of Cruot's drawings for Dior capture moments of threshold passing, movement, and becoming. The woman is captured in the state of in-between. For Cruot, Dior, and in traditional perception of the feminine, the woman is an instance of duality. In fashion shows, models stepped out of their coats and shawls like butterflies emerging from their cocoons in the process of metamorphosis, spreading their wings. The typical Dior body exhibits inner tension and outflow of energy in rotatory motion. The head is thrown backwards, either in pride or in ecstasy. The universal type of female form in motion in European art is the nymph. She mesmerized Aby Warburg to the point that he launched the new discipline of iconology, and since then, generations of illustrious scholars have explored this pathos formula in great detail. The billowing veils in Quattrocento paintings remind of the floating shawls of models in the Dior shows, who appeared shrouded in mysterious whirlwind of organza and mousseline. For Dior, as for Warburg, the nymph could incarnate the upper flight of the Platonic ideal. Pictures featuring women on the house staircase on Avenue Montaigne, leaning upwards, turning their faces to invisible sources of light, provide a metaphor of the Platonic ladder of love. Otherwise, models open curtains to the dress cabin with the pathos of tearing asunder the veil of circumstantial reality towards infinity, as if their soul aspired to dissolution in its sublimity. In many pictures, this longing is reinforced by the upward movement of hands. In the art of Renaissance and antiquity, this pathos formula signified the climax of epiphany or mystery, the moment of uncovering of the superior truth. The billowing veils and fluttering textiles evoke the wind. This pathos formula is as ubiquitous in the 1950s French fashion as it was in the art of Quattrocento in Italy, which in its turn imported it from antiquity. Richard Avedon's photos capture Susan Parker and Dorian Lay as masts among full-blown sails. In a different series of pictures, a model is hustling along Folies Bergère, leaving behind her a vaporous haze from which emerges a denuded dancer. Or she flutters out of a café with a shimmering trail floating behind her. Or de Vima in a Dior overcoat is swirling downstairs, propelled by her flapping shawl. And there are many more similar pictures. Finally, in the 1960s, the Dior model loses all gravity and literally flies. Since then, levitation has become an important motive at the brand. Flight and wind are associated with freedom as a cosmic force that thrusts and loves from heaven. The power of the wind cannot be harnessed. In Ovid, Flora is fecundated by Zephyr, and this starts the cycle of metamorphosis in Botticelli painting, inundating the canvas with flowers of earthly and celestial nature. Flowers burst into vibrant bloom from Dior skirt folds, adorning dresses with blossoming garlands. The nymph assimilates the dynamic, capricious, unpredictable character of the wind.
The new line is called Envol, or Fly Away, all very... and Rose des Vents.
Encore un souvenir d'Espagne, mais littéraire cette fois. Les fameux moulins à vent contre lesquels se battait Don Quichotte, les voici faisant tournoyer leurs ailes légères.
Dior's dress and collection names such as Cyclone, Tourbillon, Rafale, Girouette, Éventail underline the spontaneous nature of the wind and, by extension, of the woman. She is a flitting figure whose motion and therefore meaning can never be perfected. In Christian iconography, the angel of the Annunciation and the dancing Salome are commonly rendered in a nymph-like fashion. As one researcher humorously observed, it is ambiguous whether the nymph will come bearing a platter of fruit or a head on a platter. Avoiding such sinister extremes in his drawings, Cruot displayed the contrast between pure and tender breath and the thrust of fatal seduction. Galliano's models acquired tempestuous character, the frenzied ecstasy of leaving one's body and crossing the boundaries of sin. Indeed, nymphs could provoke moments of charged fascination, sacred, prophetic, and delirious. The open form underlines the fullness of life that streams out, but also indicates that the boundaries of body and emotion are not respected. The nymph Salmacis, infatuated with Hermaphroditus, successfully pleaded the gods to merge their bodies in one. The Companion of Nymph is a satire, and both of them participate in Dionysian mysteries of death and rebirth. References to Dionysus are present in Dior in the Panther print that Mitza Bricard made popular. Cruot's drawings and pictures of the house play on the opposites of bestiality and tenderness, unbridled energy and voluptuous sensuality.
I put a spell on you.
The matter of concern for modern philosophers, which in my view is germane to Dior, is that today, far from being part of the process that creates an alternative to the one, far from being part of the power that subverts the masculine closure, the woman becomes a model of a new one.
These boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you. Are you ready, Boots? Start walking.
According to Badiou, the woman one is very competitive in the modern individualistic society. She confronts the wind instead of embracing the movement and keeps her feet firmly on the ground. The woman one could not care less about the mystical sublime. She would much prefer to run real organizations. With regards to the masculine, if she gets into a relationship, it will be a contract with mutual benefits. Interestingly, Badiou uses the same term to describe the 21st century feminine as Plutarch used in the 1st century to define the god Apollo. Plutarch calls Apollo the one who denies the many and abjures multiplicity. On the contrary, Dionysus is the god of manifold change and metamorphosis. Dior's 2022 cruise collection was dedicated to Greece, and Maria Grazia Curie visited Delphi with its ruins of the Apollo temple.
Here you can also see the Oracle of Delphi, that's the main side. And the room of the priestess was inside underneath, and the vapors evaporating from the ground. And before you go in to ask the questions, you need to take seriously into consideration, know thyself.
In his book, Dionysus, the archetypal image of indestructible life, Carl Kyrenia reveals the idea of the Delphic oracle. The Attic votive relief portrays Apollo sitting on a tripod, touching the ground with both feet. This tripod was erected on the grave of Dionysus. Apollo derived his revelations from the subterranean sphere. As Jung has put it, one does not become enlightened by imagining the figures of light, but by making darkness conscious. This is the true meaning of the formula, know thyself. Art, myth, and history teach us that Dionysus, bound down by Apollo, subordinated by one, always escapes and returns with a vengeance. As I have already mentioned, the feminist discourse only concerns the couture side of the brand, notwithstanding the $13 billion transaction that brought Dior Couture under the umbrella of LVMH in 2017. Two divisions of the company, run by two different presidents, have diverged ideologically so far. On the perfume side of the brand, commercials still feature the visual metaphors of the birth of Venus or the ascension of the Virgin. Liberation, on the contrary, is always naturalistic. It transforms desire into function, energy, and libido, and this, just as naturally, leads to the loss of sexual illusion and to desublimation of the feminine body. This was particularly obvious at the 2019-20 Fall-Winter Ready-to-Wear collection that used the 1976 artwork by Tommaso Binga as the backdrop for the show. The photographs presented naked female bodies, stretched, bent, and reclined, to form letters of the alphabet. In stark contrast to the nudes of the classical and what may be called patriarchal canon. This desublimated representation of the woman contradicts Dior's vocation to exalt the lines of the feminine body. Indeed, these are not easy times for the luxury industry, since the very notion of feminine beauty comes under virulent attack as a patriarchal plot. In her book, The Beauty Myth, Naomi Wolf states that beauty is the last best belief system that keeps male dominance intact. Wolf uses the phrase cultural conspiracy, accusing powerful industries in having vested interests in making women feel old and ugly. Put on the defensive and consumed with guilt, the luxury and beauty industry is adapting its rhetorics and advertising imagery to the new standards of political correctness. In 2017, 70 years after the new look, in her interview to The Guardian and The Observer, Maria Grazia Curie avowed that she was obsessed with uniforms because a uniform is something that helps you live your life. On the contrary, At the outcome of war, Dior was convinced that people in uniform stopped being themselves, saying that couture was the lost refuge of the human and the inimitable. Pictures of Cecil Beaton and Clifford Coffin of the World War II London portray the feminine beauty as a harbinger of peace and solace. Today, in Peace and Prosperity, expensive, beautiful clothes conceal and camouflage more than they reveal or single out. Hats, sunglasses, and makeup increase the impression of uniformity. And paradoxically, the more diversity is claimed as an important value, the more identical women look. In his book, L'ère des vides, Gilles Lipovetsky remarks with perplexity that the more modern men and women aspire to subjectivity, the more apparent is their anonymity. This paradox does not lend itself to an easy explanation. Therefore, we need to examine, if only briefly, the evolution of the Occidental subject as a whole. I have already mentioned the death of the subject, but the subject who died was the one of the metaphysical tradition, with its qualities of stance and stability, permanent presence, endowed with temporal continuity, with sustained relation to self, with everything that links the subject to conscience, to history, to humanity, and above all, to law, power, and order. This concept wore thin and fell into ruin between Nietzsche and Heidegger, and was then redefined by French post-structuralist thought. The famous question, to be or not to be, was further complicated by the revision of the very concept of being, and an attempt was even undertaken to uproot the verb to be altogether. This philosophical contemplation had some practical implications, so please bear with me. Heidegger was the first who endeavored to break with the tradition of the transcendental ego. His eye of Dasein does not possess the substantiality of a thing. It is rather a way to be. He sees the self as a situational and temporal individuality. The key to the sense of being is man's decision to adopt a project to actively assume his thrownness into a finite historical situation. This choice is not grounded in any universal ontological structure. In the second half of the 20th century, French philosophy invested the best of its energy in reinterpreting, displacing, and decentering the subject. In The Logic of Sense, Deleuze criticizes metaphysics and transcendental philosophy because they consider only those determinable singularities which are already imprisoned inside a supreme self or a superior I. Using the binary logic, they disregard all else as chaos and abyss. Therefore, the transcendental philosophy chooses the finite synthetic form of the person rather than the infinite being of the individual. For Deleuze and his co-author Guattari, the only subject is desire, whose flows destroy the fictitious unity of a possessive and proprietary ego. For them, desire is revolutionary in its essence. It is active, aggressive, artistic, productive, and triumphant in the unconscious itself. No society can stand the position of real desire without its structures of exploitation, servitude, and hierarchy being compromised. Capitalism rendered obsolete the means of personal oppression practiced by territorial and despotic systems, because it requires free capital and labor flows, but it exerts control through cultural representations. Deleuze and Guattari attack psychoanalysis as an accomplice of capitalism, because through the representational theater of adipalization, it ascribes desire in a discourse of bad conscience and guilt. It betrays and translates desire. It makes it accountable to higher formations that integrate it. It makes it serve a higher social and cultural production in the name of which all resignation is justifiable. The transcendent ideal is a curse thrown on desire because it imposes on the unconscious the law of totality unity, and therefore desire is interpreted as an indication of lack. Psychoanalysis enforces this law through the synthetic concepts of global persons, the complete object, the great phallus. The ideal of wholeness, which was so important to Christian Dior, who saw its aesthetic expression in La Rose des Vents, as described by Alexander Pope, all are but parts of one stupendous whole, whose body nature is, and God the soul. This ideal is rejected by Deleuze and Guattari precisely because of this but. It indicates that a part is a mere fragment of a lost unity or totality. They argue that the notion of unity appears only when there is a power takeover in the multiplicity by the signifier. Indeed, history provides concrete examples of how the aesthetic representation of a perfectly wholesome centered subject contributed to political domination. In the 1st century AD, presenting his 10 books on architecture to the future Emperor Augustus, Vitruvius wrote, "Only an ideally circumscribable man can carry coherence with him wherever he goes, a universal model on which the Roman Empire's own unity depended. The emperor had to be represented in a body as self-contained and flawless as the world he would occupy. As a civilizer, he had to wear the canon, and in the words of Virgil, on the conquered world impose the law." For Deleuze and Guattari, power is not to be confused with force. Force breaks constraints and opens new vistas. Power builds walls. How can individuals and society change from power to force, from betrayal of desire to desiring production? By replacing the homogeneous unity with heterogeneous multiplicities, with pure, positive multiplicities, where everything is possible without exclusiveness or negation, where synthesis operates without a plan, which hold together only by the absence of a link. Such multiplicities necessarily change in nature as they expand their connections. Dior's recent show, inspired by the 60s, echoed of this random movement where multiplicity is rearranged at each throw of dice. Deleuze and Guattari call this in-organization a rhizome. They use a botanic term to juxtapose it to the arborescent structure that follows binary logic, establishes hierarchy and segmentation. There are no points or positions in a rhizome such as those found in a structure, only lines. Along these lines, desire flows freely on the body of capital, leading to a new type of social production, which operates by different kinds of synthesis, connections, conjunctions, disjunctions, constantly breaking and reassembling itself. Movement becomes nomadic. nomadism is a process of unhooking ourselves from the points of subjectification that secure us, that nail us down to a dominant reality. These ideas were very influential in aesthetics and social thought, so much so that writing at the turn of the century, Jameson complained that the area of the psychic subject was colonized by the Deleuze and Guattari notion of the ideal schizophrenic. The term nomadism is also popular with social thinkers, such as Michel Maffezoli, to describe movement in the fluid and changing society. Nomad's journey has no clear goal or destination, but today, argues Maffezoli, it also exhibits futility. Indeed, in the videos of Bureau Bitac from the recent fashion shows, models move backwards. What matters is activity, not its purpose or direction. Maffezoli argues that postmodern activity must take place relentlessly and with desperate enthusiasm to escape ennui and mask its futility. How did such revolutionary ideas end up so trivialized? The reasons are many, but the main ones are given by Slavoj Žižek in his book, The Ticklish Subject. Since Deleuze and Guattari wrote their book, another death has occurred, that of ideology. This led to the radical depoliticization of the economic sphere and to common acceptance of market mechanisms as neutral tools to be exploited. What remains the same in this global fluidity is the inexorable logic of capital. Therefore, laden by the burden of responsibility that cannot be alleviated by the helping hand of nature or tradition, today's subject is perhaps more than ever caught in an inevitable compulsion that effectively runs his life. At the same time, for better or worse, there is no big utopia, no major hope that tomorrow will be better or fairer than today. In this way, today's nomad is different from the classic pilgrim who saw his life as a conflict between static social and cultural structures and a flow of life and progress. For decades, Chanel's brand narrative was based on the idea of pilgrimage. That is, the will to transcend ossified and reified social boundaries and economic constraints. Chanel carefully manufactured these structures in the form of a birdcage, a museum grid, safe walls, and so on. In this type of narrative, passing beyond the boundaries, breaching the constraints, is the only consideration which saves us from despair, from our own limitations and finitude. The second big antinomy within postmodern individuality that Slavoj Žižek exposes in his book is the injunction to be yourself, to disregard the pressure of your surroundings, to achieve self-realization by fully asserting your unique creative potential. Yet, if you are cut off your surroundings, cut off tradition, you are left with nothing whatsoever, with a void. As Goethe once put it, the one who hasn't lived and learned 3,000 years will stay void of experience in the dark and live from day to day. This void is concealed by imitation and has caused the phenomenon described by Michel Maffezoli as near-tribalism. The postmodern tribes coalesce around the surface appearances of roles. Behind these surfaces, there are neither fixed identities nor a common historic destiny. The actors are not to be understood as sovereign individuals who decide to be one thing today and another tomorrow, but rather one recognizes here the mask that can be mutable and that integrates itself in a variety of roles and situations whose relevance exists only because they are played out by many. I would like to conclude my explication on this subject by a quote from Jameson that alongside the old close-centered subject of inner-directed individualism and the new non-subject of the fragmented self, there is a third category, that of a non-centered subject who is a part of a group or a collective. Luxury brands target these collectives. The death of ideology has shifted the focus of political activity to particular issues of gay rights, ecology, ethnic minorities, and of course, to feminism. As any political group, feminists present a united front in the face of the contender. Sisterhood is portrayed as an ideal where solidarity and mutual understanding permanently reign, and all antagonistic forms inherent in traditional feminine are abolished in the name of consensus and conviviality. There is no doubt in my mind that had he lived today, Christian Dior would be a feminist, but he would be what is called a pro-sex feminist, like Camille Paglia, who authored a brilliant book, Sexual Persona. In it, she states that feminists grossly oversimplify the problem of sex when they reduce it to a matter of social conventions. In his essay on courtly love, Slavoj Žižek maintains that insofar as, prior to being the subject, the woman is the thing, the constellation of masculine dreams and desires, fantasies and fears, such a relationship cannot be transposed on a simple, symmetrical structure. Romantic love invested women with fantasy substance of their identity whose effects are real. It allowed women to assume all the modesty and secrecy, provocation and withdrawal, all the sublime and subliminal strategies of desire. Seduction gave women power on the symbolic plane, not merely in economic or political domains. The 1948 drawing by Cruot of the Ispahan dress provides an example of such symbolic empowerment. It is strongly inspired by the 1904 painting by Joseph Rapin, picturing the Greek hetero Phryne who lived in the 4th century BC. Phryne's beauty was immortalized and canonized by Praxiteles in a palace, and has inspired artists and viewers ever since. This particular painting, though, depicts the dramatic episode of trial. Phryne was prosecuted for the capital charge of impiety when it looked like the verdict was going to be unfavorable. Her defender tore off her tunic and displayed her bosom to the judges. Her exceptional beauty inspired them with superstitious fear, and they could not bring themselves to condemn a prophetess and priestess of Aphrodite to death. Aphrodite's power of stilling the mind of even the wisest has been known since the time of Homer. In Iliad, he described how Hera borrowed from Aphrodite her embroidered zone. Two dresses, Juno and Venus, the Roman equivalents of these goddesses, featured in the 1949 collection and took a prominent place at the recent Couturier des Rêves exhibition. On Aphrodite's girdle were fashioned all manner of allurement, love, desire, dalliance, and beguilement. Aphrodite reassured Hera that you will not return with that unaccomplished, whatsoever in your heart you desire. Sure enough, licentious Zeus succumbed to the charm of his legitimate wife, and the course of the Trojan War, which in the first place had started for the sake of feminine beauty, was altered. Greek philosophy ennobled Aphrodite's mythological duplicity into duality of body and spirit. For Plato, two Aphrodites incarnated the power of sensuous beauty to guide the soul to supersensory infinity. These examples reflect the idealization of beauty that we associate with antiquity and with Dior. But if Dior, like Stendhal, believed that beauty was the promise of happiness, in other times and circumstances, women were burned as witches for the simple fact of being beautiful. Judeo-Christian tradition that links sexuality to sin contributed to its demonization. In the words of Rilke, beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror that we are barely able to endure. Dostoevsky considered beauty to be mysterious as well as terrible. God and the devil are fighting there, and the battlefield is the heart of man. Beauté, viens-tu du ciel profond ou sors-tu de l'abîme? Echoed Baudelaire in French. This controversy was raised by Silvia Giambroni in one of Dior's recent ready-to-wear collections.
That's what beauty and violence are for me. Something you are attracted to, something you have to deal with, something that have power on you, even if you don't agree.
Her words are very close to the phrase of Immanuel Kant in his Critics of Judgment, that the contemplation of aesthetically stimulating objects induces rapidly alternating repulsion and attraction. It is the point of excess for the imagination, which is like an abyss in which it fears to lose itself. The opaque mirrors with sinister thorns that may aggress and wound echo of another mirror in the Roman de la Rose. Once the lover looks into the mirror of Narcissus and sees the rose, he is wounded with arrows, which inflict suffering, and the first one is called beauty. But since he is able to overcome his narcissistic infatuation, he is saved and obtains the rose at the end. Lacan has said, only love can make jouissance condescend to desire. Eros, or love, was so important to Christian Dior as to the whole European philosophical tradition, from Plato to Badiou, because it gets us out of our solitary, egocentric self-consciousness. Love is the most fundamental modification of our experience of the world that allows us to transcend the limits of our individual finality, to embrace wholeness, and to encounter eternity. Certainly, mystics like Dior have not yet transfigured the world. The great obstacles in their way are the same as those that prevented the creation of a divine humanity. Therefore, it is important to stand one's ground and to defend oneself. But I know from experience that when a no to abuse or humiliation results in a divorce or unemployment, only love can restore the broken link to elan vital and replenish the creative energy through immersion in the stream of life. Erich Neumann, the Jungenian scholar who dedicated his whole life to the study of the feminine psychology, stated that relationship with the other is decisive for development of one's authenticity. One discovers what is one's own in and through the other. If the Dior woman is no longer content to be a mysterious goddess or an insidious seductress? What is the relationship that she would like to be part of? Can she invent the image of man that she would like to seduce or be seduced by? As a woman at the helm of Dior, Maria Grazia Chiuri is well positioned to address this question and to contribute to the emergence of a renewed but eternal feminine.